Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Jan McFarish. I'm the Education and Events Director of the Free Speech Union. I'm sure I've met quite a lot of you before, but I think there's a lot of new faces as well. So thank you for finding us and for coming and for recommending it. If there's people that you've brought along with you, that's fantastic. I'd like to thank the venue for hosting us again. I think this is the third time we've been at the Counting House, and it's just been very good to use every time. And also to Matt and to Fraser. Well, I think you might, other Fraser, but thank you to you too, other Fraser, for helping out, volunteering to help us check you all in this evening. And I wanted to introduce you to somebody you probably, lots of you know, Fraser Hudgton at the back there, who runs our Scottish office, the Free Speech Union's Scottish office, and Vinay Kapoor, who's now waving, and he is our events assistant and also works on the Ian McTaggart programme, which is a project we're doing for students, which I'll just say a little bit about in a second. So I'm going to do a few plugs at the beginning just to get them out of the way. You may not have noticed on the way in that we have these beautiful new tote bags, which they're an update on last year's design. So last year we had, I can't even remember, it was so long ago. We had two different quotes anyway, now they're new. So we've got John Milton: "Give me the liberty to know, to utter, and to argue freely according to conscience, above all liberties." Perfect Christmas gift. And then a shorter one, for those who are your friends who can't cope with a longer quote: "Freedom only to speak inoffensively is not worth having." And that was from a very famous judgment by Lord Justice Sedley. So these are £10, and this year they're even larger than they were last year for some reason. So you get an extra, I don't know, however much space for the same price of £10. Do pick them up. I've only got 12 with me, so if you want to get them, for now you have to get them from here because we haven't got an online shop sorted at the moment. What else? The McTaggart programme is, if there's any students here or people who work in universities, it's a new project that we launched in the spring, which basically offers grants to students and other people who may have recently graduated, or they may not be at university but they're in their 20s, who have a passion for free speech and for the open discussion of ideas. And whatever project they might want to do, they can pitch it to us and we'll consider it and hopefully be able to fund them. So far we've helped people to set up new free speech societies at universities in Exeter, Roehampton. Vinay is running one in Warwick. I think there's probably a couple more. We're supporting existing societies as well. So some very long-standing debate societies around the country at universities that we're helping those as well, as long as they will stick by our values of encouraging open debate and not no platforming people. They can apply for funding to us. We've also funded somebody to make a film, people to attend conferences and to help create events. So there's all kinds of things. So do pick up a postcard from the table on the way out and pass it on to a young person if you're not young yourself, or direct them towards our website. There's an apply for a grant page on our website where you can find out more information. That's that plug. And I notice somebody's put these out, so do pick up a Let Women Speak leaflet on the way out. Okay, I think that's all of the boring stuff. The house, well, it's not boring, obviously, that's the wrong thing to say. On to the meat. So I'm really delighted that we were able to take advantage of the fact that Holly Lawford-Smith was over from Australia to come to a gig actually in Edinburgh, as she says, on Monday, and we thought, right, we'll grab her while she's here, because Holly, I don't know I'm sure a lot of you have heard of Holly and read about her story. I don't know whether you'd mind me saying this, but you're Australia's Kathleen Stock.
It's funny.
2 books, both of them controversial or judged to be controversial, protested on campus, had to tolerate a huge amount of crap from students and academic colleagues, and have braved your way through it. And Free Speech Union was very happy to help Holly when her book experienced some pushback. They're just close to publication and has now been successfully published. This is the beautiful book, Sex Matters, Essays in Gender Critical Philosophy, which is not on sale tonight. That's partly because it's quite expensive. That's just a sign of quality, we like to say, but you can buy it online, obviously, and from all good booksellers, or maybe not, depending on whether they're stocking it. Yeah. So I'll introduce Holly properly. So Holly is Associate Professor in Political Philosophy in the School of Historical and Philosophical Studies at the University of Melbourne. So that's her latest book, Sex Matters, and that addresses a whole cluster of related questions that arise from the conflict of interest between rights based on sex and rights based on gender identity. And so, as I said earlier, she had to sort of tolerate, or maybe she didn't tolerate, but she certainly had to endure some really very nasty protests on campus and lots of activities against her in the way that we have become unfortunately familiar with over here. And this was, I think, largely in response to the fact that she set up a website on which women could catalogue and record incidents that were occurring in gender-neutral bathrooms and similar kind of shared spaces. And for doing that, she was targeted, and then people turned against her publications as well. But you may want to tell us more about that. And then we have Michael Foran, who is a lecturer in public law at the University of Glasgow. He's an expert in constitutional, equality and non-discrimination law, and his PhD thesis, Equality Before the Law, Equal Dignity, Wrongful Discrimination and the Rule of Law, won the York Prize from the University of Cambridge and will be published in a book this December. And I think, is that even more expensive than Holly's?
Oh, much more expensive, unfortunately. Yeah. Which again is a sign of quality. And some of you will already have seen Kapil Summan, who's spoken at our events before up here. He's the editor of Scottish Legal News, which is a daily news service for lawyers, and he's on the Advisory Council of the Free Speech Union Scotland. We were delighted that he agreed to join very early on and was here at our first event. I think he spoke at the very first event we did in Edinburgh. And the reason why we were in touch with Kapil was because he was one of the key campaigners in the Free to Disagree campaign, which won some important amendments and improvements to the hate crime bill as it was passing through. And although they ultimately couldn't defeat the bill, they raised awareness of it in a really invaluable way. So all three of our speakers are going to come in different ways to address the question, can words really hurt? And I think that's one of those questions that every week it takes on a new meaning, and there's new issues where our kind of the lines we draw on that are thrown up in the air and we have to rethink them. So it's not an easy question to answer, I don't think at all. So we need these experts to help take us through. So they'll each speak for about 8 to 10 minutes, and then we'll come out to you as we normally do, and you can ask them direct questions perhaps to start with. So start to think of those in a sort of pithy way maybe, so you can ask some very sort of practical, not practical questions, direct questions based on what they've said, and then maybe after that we'll do the longer contributions that I know you're all so good at. I'm just going to give Holly our microphone. So can we just give a round of applause for our speakers?
The last 2 chapters of my most recent book, Sex Matters, are titled Is Gender Critical Speech Hate Speech? And Is Gender Critical Speech Harmful Speech? And basically I'd just gotten so fed up with trans activists calling gender critical speech hate speech that I decided to try to take their claim seriously. There are different ways to approach these questions, of course. So one would be to sift through various state or federal level hate speech or vilification laws and related legal commentary, looking for an optimal definition of hate speech, and then to simply see whether gender critical speech would meet that bar. Globally, these laws don't often include gender identity as a protected characteristic, but it would still be interesting to learn that if they did, gender critical speech would meet the high bar for counting as hate speech. So in my state of Australia, Victoria, only race and religion are currently protected, although consultation on legal reform is currently in progress. And our current wording is, a person must not, on the ground of the race of another person or class of persons, engage in conduct that incites hatred against, serious contempt for, or revulsion or severe ridicule of that other person or class of persons. If that were an optimal definition, then it would remain only to figure out whether gender critical speech does any of those things. But I'm a philosopher, so that's not the approach I took. Not least because we'd need some criterion for deciding between competing definitions to find the optimal one. So instead, I was more interested in the underlying rationales. What is it that we are trying to protect people from when we protect against hate speech? What are the underlying values that are being upheld? So initially, I thought I'd just be able to read theories of hate speech from political philosophers and legal theorists and find a compelling rationale, which I could then think about with gender critical speech in mind. So in an honours course called Free Speech and Hate Speech that I teach at the University of Melbourne, we talk about 4 different justifications for limits to free speech, which is to say for drawing the line between free speech and hate speech. And these are preventing harm, preventing offence, protecting dignity, and protecting equality. And there are others too that we didn't cover. Protection against contempt on the basis of group membership, protection against dehumanization, and protection against psychological wounding, insult, or intimidation. Although if we countenance psychological harm as harm, then all of these could be rolled into the preventing harm rationale. And the problem that I ran into was actually the same as when I tried to read through theories of slurs to work out whether TERF is a slur, which is also a chapter of this book. And namely, the problem being both theories of slurs and theories of hate speech have the habit of relying on uncontroversial examples and explaining why they are slurs or hate speech. But my question was not why gender critical speech is hate speech, it was whether gender critical speech is hate speech. So I needed an account that could settle novel cases. But whenever I'd try to work that through, I'd just end up in the same deadlock of ideological disagreement. So take the idea that hate speech undermines dignity. So limiting free speech in order to protect dignity is justified, for example. The legal philosopher Jeremy Waldron thinks of hate speech as a kind of group defamation, where every person is owed respect in virtue of their common humanity, and this respect is undermined when people are targeted on the basis of group membership with, and I quote him, the most egregious forms of violence, exclusion, indignity, and subordination. He thinks hate speech denies a person security and assurance that they will not be subject to those things, and that giving every person such security and assurance is a matter of public order. Supposing Waldron is right, then we need to know, does gender critical speech assault trans people's human dignity, denying them security and assurance against the most egregious forms of violence, exclusion, indignity, and subordination based on their being trans? And the problem is that trans activists will say that it does, and gender critical feminists will say that it doesn't, and we don't get much closer to settling the matter. So as you probably all know, the judge in round 1, not its official name, of the Forstater case found gender critical speech to fail at a condition for philosophical belief, which included not be incompatible with human dignity. And Judith Butler, the high priestess of gender identity ideology, has said in an interview that the trans exclusionary radical feminist position attacks the dignity of trans people. But gender critical people will say exclusion from a category like woman is not the same as being excluded from society. Denying that people can change sex is compatible with respecting everyone's dignity as a human being. Merely refusing to recognize or acknowledge people as they would like to be recognized or acknowledged does not meet the high bar for the most egregious forms of violence, exclusion, indignity, and subordination. And so we have a stalemate. So what's underneath everything is, I think, how important are gender identities? If they're very important, then maybe it is a violation of human dignity or equality, or maybe it is harmful or offensive to deny them. If they're not very important, then it isn't. And we can't say whether it is or isn't without first figuring out how important they are. So I pivoted a bit at this point to thinking about a different question. Not, is gender critical speech hate speech? But more straightforwardly, should gender critical speech be suppressed? And by that, I meant to open up the question of what harm gender critical speech does, if any. What interests gender critical speech advances, if any, and how these two things balance out. And I also assumed that there was a threshold level of harm such that if that threshold was crossed, gender critical speech should be suppressed. So incitement to violence would be one clear threshold. and anything short of that threshold would be a matter of balancing the interests against the harms. Now, as anyone in the room who has been following the gender critical debate will be aware, it's just not plausible to try to pin incitement to physical violence on gender critical speech. No gender critical person goes about saying kill all trans people or anything anywhere in the ballpark of that. There are some melodramatic claims made by trans activists about their existence and relatedly their extermination or genocide, but these invariably refer to their identities, not their physical persons. So the threshold level of harm is not crossed, and that means we'll be in the business of balancing the interests advanced by gender critical speech against the harms caused by gender critical speech. And one strategy we can take here is to think about in what ways trans people are harmed in general, and then whether and how gender critical speech connects up with those harms. So in the chapter of my book that I'm drawing on here, I talked mainly about physical violence toward trans people, including murders, physical assaults, and sexual assaults. And this allows us to look at who actually perpetrates those harms and why, and whether there's a plausible connection between their motivations and gender critical speech. And you probably won't be surprised to hear that I did not think there's any such plausible connection. It seemed to me that the strongest thing that could be said is that gender critical people are outspoken in preserving a culture in which the ideas of a born female man and a born male woman are rejected. And that if such a culture were not preserved, trans people would not be subject to any physical violence. There would be no hate crime because there would be no hate, because to be a born male woman or a born female man would be normal. There would be no murder because, for one example, no man would panic when he goes home from a nightclub with a hot woman only to discover that she has a penis, etc. That might all be right, but if there's an easier way to achieve a world without violence against trans people, then it's still not true that being outspoken in preserving the idea that women are all and only those people born female and men are all and only those people born male is a contribution to harming trans people, or perhaps more accurately, to sustaining a world in which trans people are harmed. And arguably there is an easier way, namely working directly for acceptance of heterogeneity in gender expression. To finish, everything I've said so far has been about gender critical speech, and of course that's just one issue in the culture where freedom of speech is at stake, because the allegation of hate speech and harmful speech is made. But I think there's a general recipe here, and that is that theories of hate speech probably won't help very much if whether something is hateful is contested, and that it's more productive to ask directly what the harms the allegedly targeted groups suffer are, what connection there is between the speech at issue and those harms, whether the harms cross a threshold for clear prevention, like incitement to violence, and if they don't, whether protecting the interests advanced by the speech is more important or as important as protecting against the harms in question. If it's mere self-expression versus incitement to violence, then preventing harm wins and speech loses. And if it's the liberation politics of an oppressed group versus mere hurt feelings, then speech wins and preventing harm loses.
Thanks so much, Holly. There is so much in there, so I do recommend that you think or write down just some really precise questions to ask Holly, because while she's here, you might as well pick her brains, because there is an awful lot in there, and some of the categories are just really worth trying to sort of break down and work with a bit more. So, Michael.
Well, I'm going to add some more categories into the picture just to make things more confusing, I think. So I thought what I would do for my part in this talk is firstly talk a little bit about the kind of general question that we've kind of been framed here, whether words can really hurt. And then towards the end, I want to maybe do a bit of a deep dive into this Hate Crime Public Order Scotland Act 2021 and just see precisely what's trying to be addressed here. And I think some of the kind of background politics of that Kapil's going to pick up on it as well. So hopefully we're not going to cross paths too much. But I suppose the first thing I wanted to address was this kind of general question of whether words can really hurt. And what I wanted to do was to kind of interrogate what we mean by hurt here. Because I think sometimes when people ask that question, what they mean is whether words can be violent. Can they cause, and when I say cause, this is where things get even more confusing, because words themselves are not going to be violent in the sense of words themselves are not the direct cause of anything that we might call kind of physical harm that somebody suffers. But there's one point where words could potentially lead to physical harm that somebody suffers. I think there might be other areas where words or speech could lead to harm. And the real question is, what's the level of causation here? Like, how direct and proximate do we have to be in order for us to say that these words have really caused harm? And the other thing that I want to introduce is another way of thinking about this as well, which is that often I think we find an inflation of concepts, and this happens in all sorts of areas. Particularly, people have complained a lot about the expansion and the inflation of the idea of violence to include things like words. But I think we've also expanded the idea of harm to include wrongs. And sometimes you can wrong somebody without harming them. You can do something that is wrongful to that person that would warrant some kind of moral sanction or some kind of moral censure, that wouldn't necessarily lead to something that we might call harm. And the real question for me as a lawyer and a legal theorist is, what does all that have to do with the freedoms that we have under the law? So in the background, thinking about all of that, those categories might be useful to help us kind of pick out some of the kind of different ways we might think about how legal regulation might be relevant. So we might want to say that, well, legal regulation should only really occur when words cause physical violence. But if we look at the law that we actually have, that's usually not the sole category within which the regulation of speech occurs. Speech is regulated for all sorts of other reasons as well, and usually that's to do with the things that we might categorize as wrongs. So if you lie about somebody publicly, and that might lead to their status within the community being diminished, we'd describe that as defamation, and defamation will carry legal sanctions, even if it's not going to lead to you being physically assaulted at some point. And I think we see this in contexts where people are smeared, and I think we've seen a lot of smears and debates around freedom of expression and free speech. Often smears coming from people who are extremely concerned about speech causing genocidal harms, that they're very quick to describe people they disagree with as people engaged in genocide. And that might be an act of speech that's occurring here that is wronging somebody by defaming them. And so in that context, I think we can see that legal regulation might occur whether or not speech harms. But so the question we're asking about here is, does speech harm, or can words really hurt? And I think if we understand harm to include something like psychological distress, I think it's pretty obvious that some forms of speech can cause psychological distress. And the question is whether or not that kind of psychological distress is something that should warrant some kind of legal sanction. And I think in addition to that, we can be thinking about what people do when they engage in what philosophers and lawyers like to describe as speech acts, which is when you do something with words. So rather than just speaking, you do things like promise or agree or enter into a contract, or if a priest marries people or says I do, that's not just the act of saying the word I do, it's also you're doing something with the words that you do. And if we think about the conception of kind of speech acts as a thing that is something that we can recognize as something that happens, well, things that can be speech acts could include things like acts of harassment or condemnation or vilification, or instances where people are treated with disrespect. And all of these things are things I think would be relatively uncontroversial to say that they might warrant some kind of moral response. You might want to say that you really shouldn't be saying things like that. That's not a nice thing to do. That's pretty nasty. And our real question then becomes, what should the law do about that? And ordinarily within quite a lot of the societies that we're dealing with, we adopt what will be, I suppose, called kind of a classical liberal approach, which is to say that you need to meet a certain high bar for your speech before it warrants legal sanction. And that, I think, has run into conflict with other areas where you don't need to meet that high a legal bar. So defamation is one area where spreading falsehoods about someone is all you need to meet the standard of something like defamation. And what we've seen recently is an expansion of that into hate crime. And hate crime is interesting because if we think about that distinction I drew about harm and wrongs, often there isn't really an element of harm within hate crimes. There's an element of wrongdoing that's done in hate crimes. And so what we should think about when we're thinking about hate crime bills is actually to reframe them as thought crime bills, because often what this is the manifestation of heretical thoughts. And so what I want to do for the rest of the time that I've got, having rambled through a whole bunch of different distinctions that we could think about when we're thinking about speech and whether it causes harm, is look specifically at this bill. And this might be a little bit of kind of a boring read through, but the bill itself does three important things. The first thing that it does is it introduces what criminal lawyers would refer to as an aggravating offence. So it basically says if you're already in the process of committing a crime, something that's already recognised as a crime, an assault, a murder, a rape, a theft, and that crime has been in some sense motivated by prejudice, the heretical thoughts, the ideas behind that, that would then add an additional element to the crime. So the bill itself starts off by setting out this aggravation of offences by prejudice. And it says an offence is aggravated by prejudice. So again, you have to have already been engaging in a criminal offence here. But it's aggravated by prejudice where there's a specific victim of the offence. And at the time that the offence was committed, or immediately before or after doing so, the offender demonstrates malice or ill will towards the victim. Now that isn't harm. Malice or ill will is about the thoughts that you have when you're committing the actual harm that you're doing, which is the crime. So aggravating the crime by malice or ill will is adding a thought crime element on top of an existing crime. The actual harm that occurs here is the harm that's already regulated by the criminal law. And what this does is it adds an additional element to that and says, well, if you happen to have had bad thoughts in your mind while you were engaging in that crime, that meets a certain threshold level of wrongdoing. Not harm, but wrongdoing, that would warrant an additional sanction. And the sanction that they add into this is, what do they add specifically? They don't have a specific punishment here. What they say is that this will be used for, one, the logging of this crime as a hate crime. So the crime will now be logged and labelled as a hate crime as a part of the criminal justice system. And secondly, what it will add into it is that this will be relevant for sentencing. So you will suffer a more serious punishment if the malice or the ill will is demonstrated against the following characteristics: age, disability, race, colour, nationality, religion, sexual orientation, transgender identity, variations in sex characteristics. Notably, missing from this is sex. So misogynistic hate crimes, or crimes that are motivated by hatred towards women, malice, or ill will towards women, those are not classed as hate crimes, and they will not be labelled as hate crimes in the criminal system, and they will not carry any additional sentencing as a result of it. So that's just something to note, I suppose. In addition to that, the Act introduces two new criminal offences, and this is where it's attempting not just to increase the penalties that you would have for an existing crime, but creating new crimes. So the first one is what they refer to as racially aggravated harassment. So these are acts of harassment, and it has to be a series of acts here. It can't be one act, but it's acts that where someone pursues a racially aggravated course of conduct which amounts to harassment of another person and is intended to amount to harassment, or occurs in circumstances where a reasonable person would conclude that this person has engaged in harassment. And it's counted as racially aggravated if at the time that they're carrying out, the offender demonstrates malice or ill will towards the victim, and the malice or the ill will is based on the victim's membership or presumed membership within a particular racial group. Now, it has to be a course of conduct. And in addition, the definition of harassment includes causing this person alarm or distress. So the actual action that you engage in here is causing somebody alarm or distress. And if you do that while motivated by racially motivated ill will or malice, it will be classed as the crime. So the actual action you're doing, the harm here, is causing alarm or distress. And the wrongdoing element that's adding the hate crime or the thought crime element to it is that this is motivated by malice or ill will on the basis of someone's race. And so I think it's important to differentiate what harm is being caused here, alarm or distress, and then the wrong that is being claimed to be done. So again, part of this requires you to engage in multiple courses of conduct. So this is not like one course of conduct would be enough. There is a requirement that there's more than one. And there's a requirement that there's some kind of reasonableness as a part of this. And then thirdly, the offence that I think a lot of the people here might be interested in is the offence of stirring up hatred. Again, this is an additional new offence. It's not an aggravating factor of an additional crime. It's a new crime. And it occurs where the person behaves in a manner that a reasonable person would consider to be threatening, abusive, or insulting, which means insulting is your minimum requirement here. The conduct has to be insulting. Threatening or abusive are additional elements, but the minimum threshold is that it's insulting. Or that they communicate to another person material that a reasonable person would consider to be threatening, abusive, or insulting. So if I gave Holly's book to someone and a reasonable person thought that that was insulting, I have committed the offence of stirring up hatred. If, in doing so, I intend to stir up hatred, or a reasonable person considers this to be behaviour that would stir up hatred. Again, this is on the basis of age, disability, religion, sexual orientation, transgender identity, and variations in sex characteristics, but not sex. Now, there is a defence, and the defence is if somebody thinks my conduct was reasonable. If my conduct could be classed as reasonable, there's a defence here. And there's a requirement within the bill that for the purposes of interpreting all of these sections as to whether or not the defence of reasonableness applies, there has to be due regard taken to the European Convention of Human Rights protection of freedom of expression. And that's very good because the European Convention of Human Rights' protection for freedom of expression is quite robust. And it includes the explicit statement that's placed on the face of the bill that freedom of expression and those rights include the right to offend, shock, or disturb. So it's a crime to insult. It's a crime to be threatening or abusive. These are the framework in which they framed this is about distress or alarm. But remember, you're allowed to be shocking, abusive, and and disturbing, but you just can't be alarming. And the difficulty here, and I think Kapil is going to talk about this a little bit more, is that this bill has got a bit of a Jekyll and Hyde symptom to it, which is the first half of the bill is setting out extremely broad, very, very easy to meet threshold for what would constitute effectively thought crime. And then the bill has had these things added into it that are attempting to prevent the extent of that crime to extend so far as to include things that would be already protected under our human rights law and our freedom of expression jurisprudence. And so the consequence is the police have no idea what to do with this. And they've said as much. They've said, we couldn't possibly enforce this. We don't know how to enforce this. Which is, to be fair, a remarkable amount of honesty on the part of the police, because normally they're perfectly happy enforcing crimes they've known nothing about, or even enforcing things that are not crimes at all. But here they've said they don't know what to do about this, and as a result, the bill is not yet in force. We don't know when it's going to be enforced. I think there's been some rumbling that in the new year it might come into force, but ultimately it's not come into force, and that's partially because I don't think when this was drafted, there was due attention paid to this distinction between wrongdoing and actual harm. So I'll leave it at that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Michael. Kapil.
So I want to sort of commend Holly and Michael for engaging with this on a kind of rational level and taking many of its claims seriously. I'm going to be a bit nastier, and I'm going to look at it as from a sort of wider, more general perspective, in a way that I think a lot of us think about it. So the first thing I want to sort of say is that I have no idea where all of this has come from. I don't think there's a simple explanation, but there are many rivers running into the sea of stupidity that we're all currently drowning in. The late anarchist writer David Graeber, who worked himself to death, said, "The ultimate hidden truth of the world is that it is something that we make and could just as easily make differently." And what we're witnessing with what I'll call identitarianism, being woke, is an attempt to make things differently. Our societies are not premeditated. They are the result of cultural mutations which we never account for and are always surprised by. So what we have here is something that no one saw coming. It seemed like a joke, but like a joke that's been repeated too many times, it's no longer funny. So, the first point I want to make is that it's in fact a religion, which is not an original point. Many people have made it, but I think it's worth reiterating because we're doing this thing of engaging with it rationally, but engaging with it rationally is a bit like Richard Dawkins engaging with a guy who says that Allah controls the tides, and in fact it's the moon, which Richard Dawkins keeps telling him repeatedly. So religions will often speak in the idiom of the day to make their points and to obtain prestige by association. Christianity and Islam are Abrahamic in part because that's what was already there. It's easier to convince people of your points by working with what's old instead of reinventing the wheel and making something new. So identitarianism must present itself as being continuous with things like feminism and socialism, any kind of progressivism, with a dash of the key ingredient which makes identitarianism unique, and that's narcissism. It must also present itself as being continuous with science to have any credibility with people. It purports to merely be a description of facts because that's what people want. Epistemically speaking, people want facts, and facts come from science. But of course, it's not a science, it's a religion to a T. At the heart of identitarian claims is the idea that there's a true self, which has been touched on. But that is ontologically the same as a soul, which most of us hope is real, but few of us believe to be nowadays. That is a supernatural belief. We're engaging legally, socially, for the best part of a decade now with people who are pushing on us a supernatural belief. I think that's frankly insane. Now, I'm not suggesting people shouldn't have that belief any more than people of other religions shouldn't have their beliefs, but I think we have to start calling it what it is. It's hardly socially acceptable to establish a religion in the 21st century, and you're unlikely to get mass adoption. If you do, you're more likely to get a cult. So what we've ended up with is this weird situation which has been touched on, in which we're dealing with something that has to ape the conventions of science. It has to ape all sorts of conventions to pass, no pun intended, for something that it isn't. I don't think its individual adherents are consciously aware of this. I think it just vindicates the belief that we believe what other people believe. So, this new religion has changed the parameters of our culture and made all sorts of things salient for, as I said, about a decade now. And I think most ideas in life receive endorsement merely because they exist in the medium of available options and not because they indicate some truth about reality. We pick them, in other words, because they're on the menu. And identitarianism is on the menu, it seems. We pick things because they taste good, like private property, parliamentary democracy, the rule of law. But somewhere along the line, something changed. And because it changed, the one thing that you cannot say is that it changed. But the signs are everywhere that things have changed. Most people are now forced to concede at least some territory to these ideas. Some of you may have found yourself in trouble at work over pronouns, but many young people don't see it like that. For them, it's a banal courtesy to ask for someone's pronouns. We're not speaking the same language. What I'm trying to establish here is that our two groups are talking past each other. We're speaking in a kind of legacy idiom of rights and responsibilities, and they're saying that we're asleep because they're woke, and that we don't understand the nature of reality, which frankly is a delusional claim. So from our point of view, identitarianism is something people are making up as they go along. From their point of view, they're discovering latent truths in the world, and like every other ism, They coin new terms and then treat them as if they were as real as the elements of the periodic table. A certain proportion of people gleefully take to these unfalsifiable systems of thinking because the only medium in which they can flourish is bullshit. So, sensitive to the changes, our institutions are hedging their bets with identitarianism. They're aided and abetted by the government, the law, the courts, the media, and most of all, a complacent populace, something we're trying to address by meeting here and having these conversations. So I'm sure that many of you have noticed that newspapers have an odd way of speaking in what seem like homogeneous or agreed terms. Ideas very quickly become canonical, and reasonable opposition is shut out. I see this often in the context of criminal law. There are things that are called conspiracy theories that are perfectly reasonable. We're told that the teaching of cultural Marxism in universities is a conspiracy theory. That's an example of your concern being dismissed on the basis you effectively filled out the wrong form in your argument. Okay, it's not called cultural Marxism, but it bloody well exists. So I'm finding more and more this kind of letter of the law opposition to many reasonable arguments. But people can sense when you are appealing to a dictionary definition just to win the argument at hand. So in this new regime in which the cultural parameters have changed, we find that the burden of proof lies on us to prove our points. There's a kind of presumption that we're wrong, in which, try as we might, we never seem able to rebut. Otherwise, legislation that we've just talked about wouldn't have made it as far as it did, and it wouldn't be so confused. The fact that it is so confused tells you that it exists in a climate in which that's permissible. It's a bit like having a conversation with your parents. You're somehow always wrong about everything when it comes to gender and sexual identity, even when you're right. They never concede any points, and they never apologise, just like your parents, when they're wrong. Now, I think it's important to point out as well that very few people have any problem with those who say they identify as something. People can and should present however they want, because it more or less amounts to not caring about what strangers are wearing. But that is not the point of contention. The point of contention is when they try to put their claims on a surer ontological footing and swap the verb identify for the verb be. To be a man, to be a woman, what we've learned in recent years is that these are coveted statuses, especially being a woman. And people don't merely want to identify as one. They want to be one, and if they can't bend reality to their will, they'll bend language to their will, and will treat reality as being downstream of that. Now, this is classical authoritarian stuff, and the problem is they're succeeding. What ends up happening is that we apologetically express our views, as I've just done. That kind of reasonable opinion, however, often emboldens our detractors who, like sharks, scent blood. That's how you end up with Johnny, the PhD student, with whom I'm sure many of you are familiar. Staff, exactly, he's staff. So that's how sticking his pelvis out like a boy in the playground. And that's really emblematic of what one side in this debate has to say, nothing. And curiously, Johnny has deleted his Twitter account. It must have been all those videos of him sticking his pelvis out, doing the rounds. But it's nice, and his profile page is missing as well, so it's good to see that the university is, doing something. I don't know if they've done anything else. So in this brave new world, the thresholds have changed for what constitutes, for example, hate speech or a conspiracy theory. There's a different system of logic in this new regime in which non sequiturs, biases, fallacies, and pure stupidity are celebrated and encouraged, and disagreement is treated as odd and suspicious. People who disagree are in thrall to myths or are the victims, we hear, of fake news. It feels like the propensity to value feelings over facts has permeated the law, and beyond the obvious example of the Hate Crime Act. For example, we have a Tory MSP who's proposing a law on dog napping. Now, stealing dogs is obviously bad, but he wants a specific offence of stealing dogs. Well, we already have an offence, which many of you are familiar with. It's called theft. We have another Tory MSP who wants a specific offence for vandalising statues, but again, that's dealt with the law as it stands. And these are kind of minor examples. They're just a waste of taxpayer money and a waste of parliamentary time. But the original, just to get back to the Hate Crime Act, the original version of the Hate Crime Act presented a sort of view of hate crime that was so wide that it could capture anything. Everyone, obviously, we put up a campaign, and subsequently it was narrowed. But what's going on here is hidden in plain sight. It was an attempt at curtailing free speech in response really to one issue. Now, good law should stand the test of time. It should not be parochial, and it should not offer a cure that ends up being worse than the disease, which is what that seems to originally have been attempting to do. And to be honest, having heard Michael's description of it, it doesn't sound like they've improved it all that much. But most controversially, it seems to me that the culture wars have even arrived at our judiciary. There are plans in Scotland to pilot trials without juries in rape cases, which are controversial not least because they flirt with the presumption of guilt. Now, we've had a presumption of innocence since the 18th century when a Scottish barrister at the Old Bailey explained to the judge that there was a presumption of innocence in days when you could do things like that. And since then, we've had that. Now, what we have here is a situation where they're proposing to get rid of juries, but the key point is that the judges over in Parliament House are divided on this. The mainstream media hasn't picked up on this. It is frankly unheard of that the senators of the College of Justice, the most senior judges in Scotland, would be divided on whether or not you could have juries in rape cases. It tells us that half of them, or whatever proportion, we don't know, think that this would be an entirely illiberal move. And for me, that's in consequence of the culture wars having arrived there, which is just, like I say, it's been ignored by the media. Now, identitarians don't actually want free speech, in my opinion. The late Roger Scruton said that everyone is conservative about the things he loves, and I would add to that everyone wants free speech to defend the things he loves, but that few of us want to hear anything bad about the things we love. But if you want to know where the power is, you just need to look at who wants to speak freely and who doesn't want to hear it. Now, usually that system works to suppress fascists and Nazis and so on, but obviously something has gone awry. Most of us are consequentialist in our aims and want what we want because it's expedient in our circumstances: food if you're hungry, money if you're broke. So free speech is instrumental to some end for most of us, and that's why it's gone from being a left-wing principle to a right-wing one, which tells you something about the stupidity of those designations. Now, identitarians are hostile towards free speech because they're on the hearing side of the equation right now. No one is preventing them from airing their beliefs. As I've said, we have a media that acts as an auto-tune for whatever song they're singing on a given day. But in any case, if what they practice is a religion, then they don't want free speech any more than a Puritan wants it. From their point of view, it's not free speech that we're exercising, it's heresy. But it's still taboo to say that you're against free speech because that puts you in authoritarian company. So you have to frequently construe the content of people's speech as hate speech when it manifestly isn't. And that's what we're continually seeing. The most reasonable and innocuous opinions are willfully misinterpreted as exhibitions of hatred because the only alternative is to say we don't want you to question our beliefs. Frequently we're told that trans rights are human rights, which is a slogan used to drown out the complexity that arises when you have conflicting rights. To say trans rights are human rights implies that there are people who believe otherwise. It's a straw man because only cartoon extremists would say trans rights aren't human rights. 99% of the time, though, it's levelled at people who have very reasonable concerns about safety, often of their children. It might sound like I've given a silly example when I cite protesters who say trans rights are human rights, but as far as I can see, this is the entire tenor of the debate. And much of this is buried under the terms left-wing and right-wing. In reality, these are boxes with transient content. Putting transgenderism in the left-wing box and everything else in the right-wing box is a form of match-fixing. We then get mired in discussions that are, to various degrees, removed from the issue at hand and instead become abstracted into whether we stand for something left-wing or something right-wing. Very few of us want to say we stand for something right-wing, and so university chancellors, school headmasters, executives and companies all want to avoid being tainted by the slur of being right-wing. We see the examples all the time of this impotent conversation. People can be cowed into silence with the accusation that what they're saying is right-wing. At the trial of Lucy Letby a few months ago, it was uttered with scientific certainty that if you wanted her to appear in the dock during sentencing, you were right-wing.
Kapil.
Do you want me to finish up? Okay.
And then we can come back to some of this in the.
Okay, well, just to conclude, I think identitarians have made a spectator sport out of pretending that the objects of their derision are villains in order to romanticize their lives with phantoms against whom they can rail in their own personal Shakespearean drama.
Thank you, Kapil. That's excellent. Well, brilliant stuff. Can I suggest, though, that we break things down into two parts? And to start with, you get a chance to really pick the brains of Holly and Michael on this question of can words really hurt? And just really kind of ask those kinds of questions, because I've got lots, but I don't want to use my questions because I'm sure you'll have them. So my colleague Vinay here has got a microphone. You'll need to speak into it so people can hear you. So if we can just have questions to start with, and then we can move on to the kind of bigger discussion that, well, it's not bigger because this is big, but the broader discussion rather, which Kapil's raised. So Vinay, yes, chap here.
Thank you. So my question is actually for Holly and Michael. The first is, it sounds like, Holly, your arguments seem to assume that causation is necessary for your balancing exercise. Yeah. But it seems that a lot of people on the other side would say causation isn't the point. It's the creation of some social norm that continues of its own accord to subjugate people, regardless of whether you directly cause the subjugation. And so rather we're punishing you for your contribution to the creation of that norm. So I wonder what you would say to an argument like that. And then to Michael, I'm just curious as to why, judging from your own PhD research, the reasonableness of the common law wouldn't be enough to deal with the ambiguity you identify in the Hate Speech Act. Why can't just reasonable judges sitting in reasonable courts decide these issues for us, as opposed to us wringing our hands about vagaries? Yeah.
That's a great question. So I was thinking, we've moved on from monkey see, monkey do, to what's the equivalent now? Monkey say, monkey might hurt, but monkey might also contribute to a broader culture of hate. So that was my version, which is a lot more base. But do you want to answer those questions?
Do I just keep?
Yes, sorry. Yeah, you can take it out of the stand if you like.
Yeah, so it's true, when I was thinking about the physical harms like murder or sexual assault and so on, I was looking for a pretty direct causal contribution, like what are the chances that man that did that was reading my book, or Kathleen's book, or whatever. That seems crazy. But then when I backed off into that sort of second idea about like preserving a culture in which we think men are male, and that definitely is more in the ballpark of like you along with almost everybody else causing this thing together. So it's like an aggregate or emerging effect of what a group does. You could call that causal contribution at the individual level. I then just struggled to match that up with why the vitriol so much toward gender critical feminists when like most of the world is doing that. Like most of the world think women are female and men are male. So there is something that would still need to be explained, because even if it's like, well, the wrong is this much more diffuse contribution to a system, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, you still do need to explain like what this excessive targeting of gender critical feminists is about. And maybe you could tell a story, like I was really trying to be charitable here, like, okay, like if you're really against climate change activism, you're gonna target the big emitters. And so maybe the outspoken big platform gender critical people are like the big emitters, like flying around profligately and so on. It's like, okay, I can sort of get my head around that. Like we target them because they're whatever the opposite of a scapegoat, like they're the figurehead or something. So yeah, that would be one way to be charitable about that, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I might start by just contributing a little bit to this conversation, if you don't mind, and then deal with the reason. Because I think there's an element of selective seriousness about some of this. So about how serious we are to take words. So, for example, when I think as a part of this debate, when if a gender critical person says something that manifests or expresses their gender critical beliefs that's not in a particularly egregious or offensive way, but is just manifesting those beliefs, there will be this kind of claim about the contribution to an existing norm that could then generate or lead to further causing down the line by the same people who will hold up signs saying decapitate TERFs. And it seems to me that there's a disconnect going on there, because on the one hand, they will say that your actually very reasonable views that you're trying to advance are contributing to this kind of, my direct call to action to commit violence, well, that's fine. And so there's a disconnect there. And I think that disconnect, you can see a parallel between that and discussions around preferred pronoun usage. Because in that context, there's kind of a Schrodinger's pronoun, where on the one hand, it's an extremely important thing that the words have to convey the correct meaning that reflects what the individual takes to be their identity. And on the other hand, it's just a polite courtesy. Why wouldn't you possibly do it? And you could hold both of those things in your mind at the same time. But the problem is that if it is extremely serious what the content of the speech is, then it can't just be a courtesy. It's a courtesy that also happens to correspond with an extremely serious and important statement that an individual has made by saying, this person, I'll use she, her pronouns or he, him pronouns. And so it seems like there's a point at which the seriousness dial is wrapped up or down depending on the outcome that the individual is looking for. And I think this is a feature of quite a lot of rhetoric and political movements. But if you're thinking about this from the perspective of a philosopher or a lawyer who's trying to work through these and is trying to remove those things from the picture, it makes it difficult to think about this framework, because the seriousness with which we deal with those kinds of claims differs depending on the outcome the individual is looking for. Very briefly, so on the reasonableness point, I have quite a lot of faith actually in judges being able to do this quite reasonably. In particular, I think that the first time anything approaching a court case occurs with something like this bill is going to be gutted within an inch of its life. I don't think a court is going to look at this and think, oh yeah, the European Convention of Human Rights be damned, I'm going to convict this person for 7 years, by the way. The maximum sentence for insulting somebody under this is 7 years in prison. I don't think a judge is going to do that at all. I think there will be a reasonableness defence that we didn't need to put onto the face of the bill, but is on the face of the Act anyway. The problem is that until that happens, and even if it does happen, the chilling effect that this bill causes extends way beyond what reasonable judges are going to do, because you're going to have very unreasonable people, including potentially police officers, enforcing this based on the words as they're written. And the words as they're written say, if you insult someone, you could spend 7 years in prison.
Yeah. So in that sense, the law reflects the contradictory seriousness, doesn't it? So then you have law, which is about, it sets norms, so people know about this law, and it increases this idea of, well, you can't say that because people have heard about this law, but it doesn't actually necessarily have to ever be enforced. It's succeeded in changing social norms.
And you can even have contexts where, we see this with the Equality Act all the time, where every time a particular claim gets before court, judges repeatedly say, this is the correct interpretation of the law. And that interpretation is denied by people who are running advocacy campaigns. And it's their version that gets into schools, that gets into HR departments, that gets into universities. So even if you have reasonable people doing reasonable things in courtrooms, there's only so much courtrooms can do when you have ideas permeating. Like, ideas do matter, I think, and this is one of those areas where misinformation about the law could really take legs. Yeah.
It reminds me of when I was teaching sort of health to university students, health issues, and they tended to think that it was against the law to drink alcohol while you're pregnant. And because they said you're not allowed to drink alcohol while you're pregnant, and that comes back to that blurring between the moral and the legal. So yes, you might say that it's a health issue to drink while you're pregnant, or you might even say it's a moral issue if you're that way inclined, but it isn't a legal issue at present. But people have sort of absorbed it culturally nevertheless. Okay, sorry, I'm hogging things. Right, there's a lady over here in a pink jumper. So these still are brief questions, aren't they?
Absolutely. While we're talking about things being reasonable, I'd like to ask Michael about who gets to be designated a reasonable person, because I think this is something that a lot of us think a lot about in terms of the sort of the safeguarding, the inherent safeguarding that there seems to be in the idea of the reasonable person, and yet, as most people here tonight will be aware, a certain number of people who might consider themselves reasonable, it's a little bit questionable. So you're speaking right now about there being reasonable judges and so on and so forth. What's this going to look like in 10 years' time? Yeah, thank you.
Should we take one more question? Was there another one over here? The lady here, yeah. A woman, sorry. She's got the adult human female.
Yes, what you were saying, Michael, about the chilling effect, I was chilled myself this last week to see all of the tweets from police forces on Hate Crime Prevention Week, and videos and quotes. And I don't know if it was just me, but it looked as if they were saying that just saying nasty things or offensive things to people is a hate crime. I couldn't understand how the police could present it this way when it's not the law. They didn't seem, the ones I looked at didn't seem to make any distinction between the aggravating factor and the having to be an actual criminal offence first. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Okay, do you both want to come back on policing?
Do you want to start, Holly, maybe? No? Okay, so on the... do you want me to do policing first and then reasonable man second? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think anybody who knows anything about how the police operate will not be surprised to know that most of them actually don't know much about the law. And I think this comes down to the way that training occurs. I mean, the law is a complicated beast. I mean, they're not trained lawyers. They're trained to enforce. And normally it's expected that things will get sorted out by a director of prosecution or something like that. But the problem we have now, I think, is partially, social media campaigns and again, this creation of norms and ideas around this. I mean, one thing to say about this is that Scotland has an extremely broad criminal offence that relates to kind of public nuisance, and that could be used to describe something like this, and similar things can be seen in England and Wales as well, but they've ordinarily never usually been done in that context. And even in the context with Scotland, like, this bill is not enforced yet. So we don't have a framework of hate crime in here. And so it seems like, and we've seen this before with police forces that have started to record non-crime hate instances where they will say, this isn't a crime, it's not a criminal offence, we recognise that it's not a criminal offence, but we still need to come around to check your thinking anyway. And again, I mean, this kind of comes back to the idea that I think a lot of this is not hate crimes. This is about thought crimes. And I think that's where some of the difficulty comes from that.
Yeah. Do you want to come at the reasonable person? Okay.
Yeah, that's not my expertise.
Yeah. So briefly, the reasonable person is a kind of figurehead within almost all areas of law. This is not something that's unique to the criminal law. And what we really mean by that is that reasonableness is a legal artifact. It's a creation of legal principles. And so when a judge says, what would a reasonable person do? What they really mean is, what would someone who had proper account of all of the relevant legal questions and legal principles do in this context? That's ordinarily not a problem, because judges will draw in things like the presumption of innocence and presumptions in favour of freedom of expression and the long history of British law in favour of those frameworks. In fact, I think for the most part, although we have some issues with first instance judges, once you get to superior courts in the UK, they tend to be very, very good on this stuff. As they get worse, if they do get worse, then we'll have more difficulties. But that difficulty will not arise because you've used the frame reasonable person. It'll arise because the people have stopped being reasonable.
Okay, great. Yes, just wait for the microphone, otherwise nobody can hear you. No, hang on. Just one question, though, please. One question.
Yeah, well, thanks for the opportunity.
Lord Sugar.
Yeah, so the question is to Michael specifically regarding the argument you made. So, if I understand it correctly, you said that ill will is not a crime, and therefore the fact that person, while committing certain crime, had malevolent thoughts in their head doesn't mean that they should get a harsh sentence. Well, the thing is, intention is in many legal system considered an aggravating factor. If you are planning a battery, if you're actually planning to beat up a person, like let's say battery is 2 to 10 years in prison. If you were planning to do it, you'd get 10 very, very often. It's the maximum sentence. And the argument would be like, well, someone who hates, I know, black people and goes out and beats up a black guy, they were planning to do it. Not only did they want to do it, but they were actually actively planning to do it because they have this opinion in their head that, like, black people shouldn't exist in this country. So what would be your counter-argument to that?
Thank you. Let's just take one more as well, and then we'll just to get round a bit quicker. Yes, there's a lady there. Thank you.
Just in the last couple of weeks, I've had Dr. Johnny thrust his crutch at me as I tried to get into an academic book launch, with his friends literally blocking the way for me to get in. A couple of weekends ago, while trying to get into a feminist conference, I had probably 50, 100 people shout "fuck you" at you as we tried to walk in. My employer tells me on the menopause advice page that men can experience hormonal symptoms. I'm regularly called a Nazi bigot online. Why are women treated so badly in Scottish legislation? And that's without the misogyny bill that's coming up that's not going to help misogyny in Scotland. Why are women so badly treated, do you think?
I think, Holly, you're probably qualified to answer that as well. Maybe not with in relation to Scotland, but...
Women treated so badly in Scotland. I
think women are treated badly everywhere, unfortunately.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, if it's a legal question, yeah, I think.
Specifically on the Scottish question relating to misogyny, I'm not sure if it's a uniquely Scottish problem. It might be. It might be worse in Scotland, potentially because Scotland has become this kind of melting pot or this kind of powder keg for these very specific issues. Scotland's a small jurisdiction, and so these kind of things can, if you're in England and there's a conference happening in Manchester and you live in London, you might be thinking, I'm just not fucked going to Manchester, it's going to take too long. But if you live in Scotland and you live, let's say you live in Edinburgh and there's something happening in Edinburgh and then there's something happening in Glasgow, it's very quick and easy for people who want to attend those events to attend, but also the people who might want to protest at those events. It seems like, unfortunately, there's a particular problem with this at Edinburgh University, and in particular with the staff. Is it the Staff Pride Network? Is that what it's called? I think there seems to be a particularly authoritarian streak within that network, and they seem very well organised, and that could cause quite a lot of what we're seeing here. I think it is telling that the hate crime bill did not include sex. I think it's telling that, and I'm certain the reason why was because there's just so much sex-based hate crime happening, we couldn't possibly try to regulate that. Let's just keep that going.
Can I just pose that something similar to Holly? I mean, where in Melbourne, your university in Melbourne, I mean, what laid the ground, do you think, for the reaction to you? What had other people been identified already? I mean, why was it so public and vicious towards you, do you think?
Yeah, look, I don't really... I feel like the situations are exactly the same in our two countries, and I just don't know what the... maybe it's just like it's such a big question, right? Like, it's in addition to all the normal sexism and misogyny and the women's struggle that has taken many shapes, like, okay, and then now we have this particular lunacy. Kapil, I think, did a really good job of capturing some aspects of it, and that's maybe given cover to a lot of the misogyny that was there already, because now you can have like progressive left-wing misogyny. Yeah, I don't know. That doesn't really speak exactly to Unimel, but we're kind of having the same problem. We're trying to introduce new vilification laws in my state on hate speech, and it was explicit in the parliamentary inquiry that they thought sexist hate crime or sex-aggravated hate crime, or even just like I think online abuse, it was just you can't do anything about a problem of that size. That was explicit. So they're kind of doing what they can for disability and intersex conditions and like the sort of more manageable sized minority groups. And actually, one thing that's interesting in Victoria is that it's still up for debate whether the protected attribute in our vilification, because we have race and religion, but we're going to extend out, the initial motivation was to protect women. And now there's a fight on, because of gender identity ideology, over whether the named attribute will be sex or gender. And they're already wanting to add gender identity and sex characteristics. So trans are either 3 times protected, with slightly different words, and women not at all, or maybe we'll get lucky and sex will end up in there, but it's like completely unclear whether that will happen. So, yeah.
Thank you. Okay, you better come over this side. So we're still going to take a couple more sort of short questions, please, and then we'll do longer points. So there was just one person with a hand up, and now there's 3. So the woman in the middle was the first one.
Hi, I actually have a few quick comments. So
sorry. Can we come to those in a moment and just stick to questions for now?
Okay.
I know that sounds brutal, but I just would like to really get the most out of Holly and Michael on the factual side of things. Is that a question?
Yes, it is. In the summer this year, my colleague Julie was assaulted at a women's free speech event up in Aberdeen, which the police decided not to charge. They did received police warning. We were then threatened with a hate crime charge for one of our speakers talking about pornography. The question I have is, should women identify as lesbians in order to have some protection under new hate crime laws?
There must be certain perks to that. Any others on this? Any other questions on this side? Is it a question?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
For the hate crime bill that is saying sex transgender identity, is this just not another way of bringing in self-ID?
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, we'll take another one. There was somebody else. Yes, in the green. Thank you.
Hello. How much do you think we need to look at the root cause of, say, when people decide to be offended by something? We've seen in the media over the last few years, some of these issues didn't even exist. So when there is a court case, at what point is it analysed that, okay, so why do you feel like this? When did this start? And where does the blame get put in that situation?
Yeah, that's a great question. Just kind of standing back a bit from the specific issues to this question of harm. How did we get to this level of ramped up harm claims, and what were the steps to that? Either one of you.
Maybe just something quickly before I pass that on. So I guess one thing is like what's happened in the culture, why they feel like that. And how can we explain that, and how can we work on them feeling less like that rather than everyone else shutting up? But the other thing I really worry about is, do they actually? Because it's like you're really handing a weapon to political activists when you take seriously like something like, you mentioned distress, I think, in your opening remarks. So now, okay, suddenly I'm incentivized to be as distressed as possible because that's a way to silence my opponents. So yeah, for me, that's a real reason to stay away from any of those, if I could write the law, which obviously I can't, but it would be a reason to stay away from any of those kind of emotion-heavy terms in thinking about what the law should be preventing, because it's just too easily gamed by activists. Oh, well, you've got your own.
Yeah. So he doesn't need to.
This is sexism at work.
Yeah, that's right. Intersectionality.
Yes.
Two microphones.
That last question is a really interesting question, because I think there's an interesting trajectory that we've seen. Because I think in the kind of mid to late 2000s, offence was the lens through which all of this was looked at. Now, I don't think people talk about being offended as much anymore. I think back then, offence was the thing that was interesting, and people would talk about being offended by something with the expectation that this would have social, cultural, and legal cachet to it. And that failed. And part of the reason why it failed was because there were successful legal cases where courts said mere offence is not sufficient to limit speech. It's also, I think, because comedians and other people involved in these kind of debates ridiculed the idea that somebody being offended by something mattered. And so I think what ended up happening is that the conversation actually shifted quite considerably away from offence and onto things like hurt or harassed or vilified or defamed, like group defamation. These are other ways of capturing the same kind of claim or concern that's been brought through, but we're not using the offence framing anymore. And I think that's because that argument was run and didn't work. And so what we're seeing right now are alternative arguments being brought through in court systems, in legal systems, and also as a part of culture. And I think as a part of our culture has shifted quite significantly on this. I mean, I think a real telling change over the course of the last 20 or 30 years is that most comedy shows have more clapping in them than laughter now. And I think that's a result of the fact that our culture has shifted away from one of irreverence and kind of fun, and there's a lot more about being right rather than being funny or being or being able to kind of just explore ideas anymore. Now you have to have very strong views and they have to be agreed with. So yeah, on that specific point, I think offence has actually moved away from, or we've moved away from offence.
Yeah, Kapil.
SNP is perversely incentivised to sort of go along with these things, and it got greedy and it thought that it could keep everyone happy. Bear in mind that there is a misogyny bill, and they're going to have a hell of a time dealing with that, because when they had the idea for that, they thought all of these things would come together as interlocking parts. But what you're going to end up with is a situation in which our friend Johnny could be both victim and perpetrator on the same night, because he's been a misogynist and, you know, he's going around crying about someone not saying something to him. So as I say, I think the SNP has just been perversely incentivised to do this, and I think there might be something that ties in with nationalism and ties in with being a small country and trying to have some sort of standing on the world stage. I mean, if you're a big country like China or Russia, you don't have to talk about these things because you have nuclear weapons, you have clout. Scotland has to achieve its clout in other ways.
I thought you did have nuclear weapons up here.
Yeah, but they're UK.
Not yours.
Yeah.
Michael.
I just wanted to just pick up on the question the lady asked there about whether this is self-ID via the back door, because I think that's an interesting question. We've had a long debate in Scotland about self-ID, the idea that if you identify one way, you get all the legal rights that come with that. I think as a matter of strict law, no, this would not be anything approaching something like self-identification via the back door. This would be read in its absolute best light. This is an attempt to protect people from certain forms of wrongful and potentially also harmful conduct. The risk is, as the risk is in all of this, is that if, let's say, you had, for example, a rape crisis shelter that wanted to maintain itself as a female-only rape crisis shelter, and you had, let's say there was someone who wanted to apply to be a member of staff there who identified as a woman but who was biologically male, and they were told, I'm sorry, you don't meet the criteria to work here, very politely, not an attempt to try and insult or ridicule this person, that person could then claim that they had suffered from a hate crime. Now, legally, this would not meet anything near the standard of what would be set out in this bill, although they have the start of it where they talk about insult and things like that. The bill clearly has defence of reasonableness and clearly has a defence relating to freedom of expression. And the reasonableness, I mean, if you're just repeating back the law set out in the Equality Act, it's not going to be unreasonable. But the concern is not about whether strict legally that's going to be the consequence. The concern is whether or not this is another thing that could be a tool for misinformation about the law. And I think that is a risk.
Thank you. Right. I'm not inviting long contributions now, just because we're going off the strict questions end of things. So do keep them fairly short so that it's fair to everybody else. But are there other hands to go up? Yes.
I'm actually a detransitioner and a former trans rights activist, and basically I want to make a few quick comments. So in terms of asymmetric intelligibility, it's worse than you think. It's Tower of Babel level bad between the two factions, even though there shouldn't be two factions. The public aren't homogenous or conciliatory, they're actually afraid. GC women are being made an example of because they are women, and there is a large misogynistic element of TRAs, especially ones who are high up, usually 50 plus trans-identified males, because their fixations are actually driving a large portion of the pushback, because the whole thing is validation. And I would also argue that it's more of an incitement to violence, blanket validation is more of an incitement to violence as it leads to cavalier surgeries. So detransitioners are largely vulnerable women and girls, rape victims, bulimic, anorexic, and they end up under the knife of a surgeon. And a self-harmer does not need a bigger knife with which to cut, especially state-sanctioned, privately funded, or by proxy. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that raises a really interesting question about where the threat of violence underpins a claim of harm. And I think you can say that with Islamism as well, with radical Islam, where the kind of the violence has already happened, if you like. So we've already had Charlie Hebdo, we've already had Salman Rushdie, we've already had various kind of terror attacks. That is there, and that kind of threatens everybody, not just women. Whereas in the turf wars, or whatever, gender critical wars, there's the kind of threat of violence against women particularly, which kind of then is there when the harm claims and the silencing tactics are then used, but it's got this kind of, the power is already there because the violence has actually been evident. Anyway, sorry. Yes, right away over this side, Fraser. Sorry. It's good for you.
Yeah. Thank you. First of all, I'd like to say thank you for being able to express the thoughts of the masses. There's a lot of times people believe things but can't actually articulate what they mean. And I think you guys do a really good job of that. I think a big question I want to put forward is, from the transpiring events with the Israel-Palestine, we've seen a lot of protests from both sides, but especially from the pro-Palestine side. I'm obviously free speech advocate, but is there any difference in legality between an individual expressing free speech and a protest or a big group? And I know it's hard to define a group. Is there any differences in legality in that sense, or should there be in that sense?
That's a very interesting question. One other? Yes, the lady there.
Hello, hi Holly, you're a heroine of mine, thank you. And I'm wondering, with your academic colleagues, is there any bigger conversation about basically criminalising normal people? 95 to 97% of the world's population is gender critical. So when I have to explain to my wee niece that her thinking a man cannot be a lesbian, she's protected because she's gender critical, she thinks I'm mental. And most people, normal people, are being criminalised, like this man said. And are your colleagues aware that they're criminalising normal people?
Thank you. I'll just take one more, Shireen down here, and then we'll come back for final comments from the panel, and then we can go to the bar.
Thank you. So the afternoon before Johnny did his thing with the pelvis thrust, Johnny was...
Sorry, do people... Hands up if you don't know what on earth people are talking about.
Please.
Sorry, oh my goodness, I'm really sorry. Okay, really briefly, Shireen, could you just explain, without defaming anybody, what this incident is, really briefly, before you then...
There was a book launch at Edinburgh University of Sex and Gender, a contemporary reader, and in the protest outside the book launch, activists deliberately sat in front of barriers to try and stop people getting in. And Johnny, who's a member of staff, was filmed thrusting his groin at a woman who was trying to make it to the barrier to get into the building.
Thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Hang on, was Johnny wearing trousers?
You're particularly interested in that fact, Tom. It is a material fact, yes.
But before he did that,
The trousers.
Johnny had been in a large meeting in the University of Edinburgh where he'd said to several hundred colleagues, some in the room, some on video, that there was about to be this terrible, hateful event going ahead at the university, and there's real risk of harm to him and others. And as I saw it, it was the ramping up and the escalation of that kind of fear. And I was also in the meeting, and I didn't know, it wasn't a meeting about the book launch at all, it was a meeting about something completely different. So I didn't have long to counter it. And I was wanting the perfect set of things to say that, to convey to my colleagues that there was no risk to anybody on campus that evening other than attendees of the book launch. The attendees of the book launch weren't the source of risk to health and safety, the way they were being portrayed. And I couldn't think of the perfect way to say it in 3 well-chosen sentences, which was all I had time for. And I'm wondering if you can help me out. If I were to go back in time, what would be the perfect way? Because this happens all the time. I won't go back in time, but there will be many other opportunities, I'm sure. What's the perfect, quick and succinct way to undermine that argument that gender-critical feminists and those who support them, or those who are critical of critical race theory, which is another red flag on our campus, what's the perfect way to undercut that argument quickly and succinctly in a way that people who aren't paying attention, who are invested in not engaging, can still see?
Great, thanks. That's a perfect end question, Shireen. Should we go back along the panel, starting with Kapil? So pick up anything you want.
Well, I can't think of 3 sentences, but I can think of 2 words. I don't have anything else.
Very neat. Is that it?
Yeah.
So the woman who mentioned detransitioners, I think, has left. But I think this is an extreme black hole in the legal, the cultural. I mean, a little bit of this has been spoken about within the context of kind of people who might be gathering in these kinds of events. But legally, this is something that has just been completely disregarded. And I think that's the next area where we're going to see like serious legal challenges coming, are going to be people who have detransitioned, who are then suing for medical negligence in contexts where they have felt that they have not been treated with the kind of due care that it warrants them, particularly given the vulnerable situation that they've been in. I think if I was to predict anything for the future of any of these topics, it's going to be that as a legal issue, particularly in the UK. This isn't like the US. In the US, there's almost no chance that something like that's going to happen because we've already had a lobotomy scandal. And the lobotomy scandal in the US resulted in insurers tightening up the laws to ensure that medical negligence just doesn't cover something that everybody is doing. Whereas here, the NHS does have much more robust practices on this, and UK law is better on these questions. It's not perfect, but it's better. So I think that's going to be an area where we're going to see a lot of things. The questions on protests is an interesting one because legally, there's much more justification for interference with freedom of expression if you're engaged with an extremely large group of individuals, and there's a risk that this might boil over into either the obstruction of the enjoyment of rights of others. So if you've blocked a highway for days on end or something like that, that's much more likely that you're going to be subject to justified lawful interference, and that includes also concerns about risks of violence. And I haven't been following too much, but it seems like quite a lot of these protests have erupted into some forms of physical violence, and that would warrant some kind of interference. In terms of the actual content of the messages that are spoken, again, that might come up again, because incitement to commit violence, let's say if you stood up in the middle of a protest and said, if you see a turf, punch her in the fucking face, that, in my view, is that's the crime of incitement. And there's an aggravating factor given how many people you have expressed that to. Shireen, I think the only thing I can say, particularly in the context of a university, is something along the lines of ideas are not violent. And people writing about ideas, people thinking about ideas, people talking about ideas, people meeting to discuss ideas is not violence. And if anybody wants to argue that there's a threat of harm, they need to be very careful about how proximate that threat is, particularly if they're coming along and threatening harm in addition. I mean, you see this happening a lot where the claim that a group of people are likely to commit violence is then used to vilify those people and is then used as a justification for punching Nazis and is likely to lead to violence. So if I had 2 points to make, I mean, one, ideas, thoughts, education in a university setting is not violence. And secondly, people need to be very careful about the accusation that ideas are violent or that people are violent, because that could lead to violence. And they need to be aware of that. That they could be causing, for example, sexual assaults to occur in protest because someone has thrust their groin repeatedly into someone. And he thinks it's perfectly fine to do that because the people he's doing it to are evil and hateful. And so by vilifying people like that, you contribute to that kind of culture. And that is the argument that people on both sides are going to be making. The question is whether or not the words and the speech that's used in this context is actually proximate or likely to lead to that kind of violence. And I think it's more likely when you're calling people things that are extremely derogatory or that actually do constitute an expression of contempt towards those people. And less likely when you're expressing your philosophical belief that sex is binary.
Okay, the person at the back asked, are my colleagues aware that they would be criminalizing normal people? I think they're not aware. And the reason is I think most people, colleagues included, I think they just see a very superficial version of what's going on in this debate. They just see a lack of kindness and they see a failure to protect the vulnerable, and that's a gender norm, right? So it's a particular failing when women don't do that. So I think what they see is just like, yeah, gender critical women are mean or something like that. But I have a little hope in making progress on that because I think there is this huge ideology underlying like trans activism. And I think, Kapil, you were pointing to it's a religion. I think that's right. And I don't know how many people are trying. I'm trying to put it in bullet point form. What are the claims here? Like, yeah, your sex is like totally, yeah, you get it at birth and then it's up to you and you can change it really easily in the following ways, right? Once you write down the content of what all those like beliefs and commitments are, it's really clear that it's a substantive ideology. And then I think it's like much easier to show how insane it is, and then that most people will disagree with those claims. Then it's not a kindness thing anymore, right? It's really like, no, you've got 20 completely off the wall commitments here, and most people aren't going to agree with those. So yeah, they're not aware, but I think they could become aware, and I think the work that everyone's doing to try to like illuminate what this ideology is helpful there. And the only idea I really had to say to Shireen, and maybe it kind of relates to that, is that once you have really spelled out the ideological disagreement, these ones think sex is immutable, these ones think sex can be changed or sex is up for grabs, you have your list. It's much more plausible to draw your parallel to something like religious toleration. And you could probably find great historical examples too, right, of like how much harm and distress people thought not believing in the right religion caused at a particular time. And there's great examples from this country. So maybe something like that, a pithy 2-sentence analogy to religious mutual toleration and examples from history, and then just kind of reassuring people that this is just like that, like we're all safe, and we disagree with each other, and that's okay. So I don't know if the sentence is for you, but I feel like that kind of analogy would be the thing to look for. Yeah.
Thank you to our speakers. We're going to wind up now. I just wanted to really make a pitch for the Free Speech Union, and I know there's a lot of people here that aren't yet members, and I can tell that because you're very honest when you buy tickets. And rather than pretending to be in order to get the discount that you could have got, half price discount, you've actually paid the full amount, which I do thank you for, but I would rather you were members. One of the things, well, there's a whole number of things that we do, and I think just to kind of carry on from what was being said just now, one of the things I think we do just by existing as a collective is that we can re-legitimise the demand to be able to speak freely, because that has been delegitimised. And I think one of the problems, and I've had this, where rather than when the harm claim seems quite weak, what then happens is that the speaker is delegitimised in all kinds of ways, whether that's by the slur of TERF, cis, which has been pretty much spat at me, and is presumptuous, I think, white, coloniser, whatever that might be. And these things move really fast and we need to keep up with them as the new ones emerge. But we do have to have a kind of collective representation of those of us who wish to speak, and that isn't a kind of disrespectful position. That's people who take democracy and public debate really seriously. And so I think that we need a collective representation of that, and I do think the Free Speech Union is doing a really good job, and it gives that we can just by meeting other people, you realise that you're not the monsters that other people like to sort of label you as. The other thing that we do really well is we are able to support people like Holly. So when they have a difficulty, for example, with a publisher, we won't say much about it, but we were able to offer legal advice, as far as I understand it, to Holly to make sure that her book did get published. And we're doing this all the time. You know, we're writing letters. Fraser is a director of case management, and he is dealing with hundreds and hundreds of cases. You can see them etched in his poor face. But this is what we do, and any dues that you pay to us on a monthly basis, if you don't need our help, you can help us help other people through doing that. I can't read my writing, it's too small. The other thing we do is legislative affairs, and whether that's challenging hate crime legislation, whichever form it pops up in whichever jurisdiction, we can challenge it and understand it and make the arguments against it. The misogyny bill, which I know we've been talking about behind the scenes for quite a while. Conversion therapy, the ban on conversion therapy, we've quite successfully been involved in lots of toing and froing on that question. And so there's all these kind of different facets of what we do that I would really encourage you to join us, because you're part of something if you do that. You support us to help individual members, and also you may well protect yourself. Well, we'd love to protect you if you do get into trouble for exercising your right to free speech. So thank you all for coming, and no, I'm not going to take it. Oh, sorry. Yeah, okay. Quick plug.
Okay. I recently...
Have we got a microphone?
I can get you.
Run.
Overstep.
Thank you. We all have so many calls on our funds, but I finally did join the Free Speech Union very recently because I took part in an event down at Canterbury Christchurch University. I hadn't realised that you actually support academics to... I can't remember the name of it, Academics Free Speech Association or whatever.
Academics for Academic Freedom. Well, that's a separate organisation, but we do know lots of them.
Oh, I see. I thought you...
Lots of them are members, and we do help them out.
Yes, because they had their first ever free gender critical speaker. They had Alice Sullivan come and talk, and it was a really big thing. And the university was not keen on supporting it, but you know, there is that sort of momentum, and I just think it's so valuable, and this brilliant tiny team of people down at Kent University and Canterbury Christchurch, whatever it is, and you know, just really, it's so fantastic that they are prepared to put their head above the parapet, and if there isn't something like the Free Speech Union and others, you know, it just, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I know for a fact that all of those people are members. Yes. And my old mates from the University of Kent as well. Okay, so there's leaflets at the door. You can join by just scanning the QR code. Talk to us if you don't quite understand what you need to do. Buy a tote bag. Stick around for a drink. More importantly, I have to go and get vodka down me now because I'm behind everybody else. And can we just thank our panel again?